The bet was his idea, which is the important part. If it had been her idea, there would have been something to prove, a position to defend, a reputation attached to the outcome. But Ezra Flood had made the proposition himself. In front of 4 other men at the Millbrook Trading Post in October of 1866, because he was the kind of man who said what he thought, and thought what he said, and what he thought. Watching a woman explain a heating system to the trading post owner was that this was not going to work. He had said, "I will give you my north pasture fence line, 40 rods of cedar posts and wire. If you can heat my cabin through January on less wood than I burned last January." The woman's name was Ruth Calder. She was 44 years old, a widow who had been farming 60 acres of eastern Nebraska territory since 1861, and who had spent the previous 5 years developing and refining the underground flue system she was now explaining to the trading post owner, who had a cold storefront and was interested in what she had to say. Ruth had looked at Ezra Flood when he made the offer, and she had taken the measure of it the way a practical woman takes the measure of a proposition from a confident man, which is to calculate not whether she could do what he was proposing, but whether the outcome was worth the effort. 40 rods of cedar fence posts and wire was worth significant effort. Cedar fence was expensive, and she needed it on the east boundary of her claim, where the cattle from the neighboring spread kept finding their way through. She said, "And if it does not work," he said, "nothing. You lose nothing but the winter." She said, "I accept," he said, to the 4 other men. "You are witnesses." This was October 14th, 1866. She had until the end of January, 3.5 months, to install an underground flue system in Ezra Flood's cabin and heat it through the winter on less than his previous year's consumption, which he told her had been 5.5 cords. She went home and opened her account book to the pages she had been keeping since 1862, the records of her own underground flue system's performance, and she read through them with the specific attention of someone who is now reading their own notes as evidence rather than as memory. For winters of daily temperature records, for winters of fuel consumption, her own system, in her own cabin, had never exceeded 2 cords in any winter since she built it. 5.5 cords versus 2. She had a margin she could work with. The system she had developed on her own claim between 1861 and 1862 was built on a principle she had encountered in a German farmer's barn in the 2nd year she was in Nebraska territory. When she had gone to buy a horse and had stood in the barn waiting for the farmer and had noticed that the barn was warm in a way that barns were not usually warm, a deep, even warmth that was not coming from any fire or stove she could see. The warmth was coming from the floor. She had looked at the floor and seen that the packed earth floor had several long, low ridges running east to west across it, as if something ran beneath the floor surface in parallel lines. She had pressed her boot against one of the ridges and felt the warmth through the leather sole. Then she had crouched and pressed her palm to the earth between 2 of the ridges and felt the warmth there too, radiating upward from below the surface. When the farmer came, she had asked about the floor. He had explained it in German and then in the English he had been learning since 1858, which was adequate for practical conversation. Channels below the floor, fed from the stove at one end. The hot air traveling through the channels before it rose and exited through a flue in the far wall. The stove heated the channels. The channels heated the earth. The earth heated the floor. The floor heated the barn. He had learned this, he said, from his father, who had built the same system in Bavaria before emigrating. His father had learned it from his grandfather. It was old. Ruth had asked 3 questions, and the farmer had answered them, and she had gone home without the horse she had come for, because the horse she had seen was not the right horse. And she had sat at her kitchen table and drawn the channel layout as she understood it, from the farmer's description and her own observation of the barn floor. She had built her own version the following spring, modifying the layout to suit her cabin's dimensions and the available materials, which were Nebraska Territory materials in 1861, fired brick from the settlement at Platte, river junction for the firebox, fieldstone from the creek for the channel walls, clay from the creek bank for the mortar, and the specific mix of sand and cut dry grass that she had tested through the summer before she trusted it in the channels. For winters later, her system was performing better than her original estimates, and she had refined the channel dimensions and the firebox placement and the flue exit angle 3 times as she learned what the system needed to run optimally. She knew the system the way you know something you have built and maintained and corrected and improved, which is to say she knew it completely, in her hands and in her numbers. Ezra Flood's cabin was different from hers, and the difference mattered. His cabin was a standard Nebraska frame structure, 14 by 18 feet, single-thickness hewn oak walls with straw and clay chinking, a large stone fireplace at the west end with a conventional chimney rising through the roof. He had been burning 5.5 cords per winter for 3 years, which was not profligate but was not efficient, and the cabin was comfortable in October and November and cold in the hard stretches of January and February, when the fireplace could not maintain 60 degrees against a sustained north wind. She walked through the cabin twice before she said anything. She pressed her hand to the fireplace stone. She looked at the floor. She looked at the ceiling. She walked the perimeter of the exterior and pressed her hand to the chinking at several points on the north and west walls. She came back inside and stood in the center of the room and looked at the floor again. Ezra was watching her from the doorway. He said, "Well," she said, "your chinking is letting air through on the north wall. That is heat you are buying and sending outside. Before I touch the floor, I am going to seal the north and west walls with fresh clay. That is 3 days of work before the main work begins." He said, "The bet is about the floor." She said, "The bet is about the fuel. The floor system cannot compensate for air infiltration through the walls. I am sealing the walls as part of the installation. If you want to win the bet, you will let me work without interference." He was quiet for a moment. He was a man who respected clarity, and she had been clear. He said, "Do what you need to do." She came back the following week with her son Thomas, who was 19, and had been helping with the maintenance of her own system since he was 15, and with the materials she had calculated for the installation, fired brick for the firebox modification, a quantity of fieldstone and clay she had premixed to the correct sand ratio and transported in the wagon, and the iron hardware for the flue connections. The channel system she designed for Ezra. Flood's cabin was different from her own in 3 specific ways that the different situation required. The first difference was the entry point. Her own system fed from a dedicated firebox she had built into the south end of her cabin, separate from the cook stove, designed specifically to provide low, steady heat for the channel system without the variable temperature spikes that cooking fires produced. Ezra's cabin had no second firebox, and she was not going to build one. She was going to feed the underground channels from his existing fireplace, which required a different junction design. A client opening at the base of his fireplace that would divert a portion of the fire's hot gases into the channels rather than sending all of it up the chimney. The second difference was the channel routing. Her cabin had a dedicated crawl space below the floor that she had excavated before building the floor, giving her clean access to the full channel system. Ezra's cabin had a packed earth floor with no crawl space, which meant she was excavating below an existing floor with limited working room. Thomas did most of this work, which required lying partly on his side with a short-handled spade in a space that was never more than 18 inches high. The third difference was the exit flue. Her system exited through the north wall above grade, which was the most efficient angle for the draft she needed. Ezra's north wall was where the cold came from and where the wind would create back pressure in a north wall flue. She designed his exit through the east wall, using the natural east-west draft of the Nebraska plains to pull rather than push, which required a longer channel run but produced more reliable draft. The work took 11 days. Thomas did the underfloor excavation and chanu laying, working his way from the firebox entry point south and east in the pattern she had drawn on paper the week before. She did the firebox modification, cutting the diversion, opening at the fireplace base and lining it with fired brick, and the interior clay ceiling of the north and west walls, and the exit flue construction through the east wall, and the supervision of Thomas's channel work, checking each section before the next was begun, and correcting the grade where she found it was not consistent. On the 11th day, she laid the channel capstones, the flat fieldstone slabs she had selected for uniform thickness, and packed the joints between them with the clay mix, and let it cure for 2 days before she let Ezra build a fire. Ezra had been watching the work when he was not doing his own farm work. He had watched Thomas in the crawl space with the short-handled spade, and had said nothing except once. On the 4th day, when he had looked at the excavation plan she had drawn on paper, and had said, "How do you know the clay will not crack?" she had showed him the account book. She had pointed to the maintenance entries for 4 winters, the autumn inspections, the places where small cracks had developed, and how she had found and sealed them. She had said, "It cracks. The maintenance schedule exists for that reason. What cracks I find and seal before winter. This is not a flaw. This is the annual practice the system requires." He had looked at the 4 winters of maintenance entries and said nothing further. The first fire in the modified system burned on November 3rd. She had come back to oversee it. Ezra built the fire in his fireplace, a moderate fire, the kind he would build on a November evening that was cold but not severe. She watched the smoke at the fireplace opening. The majority of the smoke rose into the conventional chimney. A portion of it, perhaps a quarter of the total volume, moved sideways at the base of the fireplace and entered the diversion channel. She watched this for 5 minutes. The diversion was working at approximately the proportion she had designed it for. She checked the exit flue on the east wall exterior. Smoke was exiting there, thin and cool, having given most of its heat to the channel walls and the earth on its way through. She pressed her palm to the floor at the center of the room, above the main channel run. 40 minutes after the fire was lit, the floor was warm. She said to Ezra, "Press the floor." He crouched and pressed his palm to the plank floor. "Okay." He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "That is warm." She said, "That is the floor." "Okay." "The channel is below it. The heat is traveling through the channel and giving itself to the earth before it exits. The earth holds it and gives it back upward through the floor." He stayed crouched, his palm on the floor. She said, "The floor will be warm tomorrow morning before you light any fire. Not as warm as it is now, but warm. The earth holds what it has been given," he said, "and in January." She said, "In January the earth will have been receiving heat since November. The baseline temperature of the floor will be higher in January than it is now, because the thermal mass has been accumulating for 2 months. You will burn less wood in January than you burned today. He stood up and looked at her. He was a man who had formed an opinion in October and who was now standing in his own cabin with his palm warm from his own floor in November, and the opinion was changing in the specific way that opinions change when the physical evidence requires them to. He said, "I have been burning 5.5 cords," she said. "You will not burn 3 this winter." "Possibly less," he said. "That is not less than 2 cords," she said. "It is less than 5.5. The bet is less than last January. My record at home is 2 cords over a full winter with a system I have refined for 4 years. Your system is new and installed under an existing floor with constraints mine does not have. I will not promise 2 cords. I will promise less than 4." He said, "Less than 4 is less than 5.5. She said, "Yes." He nodded. He built up the fire, and she went home. The winter of 1866 to 1867 in eastern Nebraska was the kind of winter that tested everything it touched. The cold arrived in December and held through January. Without the brief thaws that sometimes gave the prairie a week of manageable temperatures in the middle of the hard months. The sustained cold ran from December 18th to February 4th. 47 consecutive days below zero at some point in each 24-hour period. The longest such stretch the valley had recorded. During those 47 days, the 4 men who had been witnesses at the trading post in October all stopped by the flood cabin at different times for different reasons. The first came in late December to borrow a tool. The second came in early January to discuss the spring planting. The third came in the second week of January on no errand at all, simply because he had heard what was being said in the valley about the flood cabin's warmth and he wanted to feel it for himself. Each of them noticed the floor. Each of them pressed their hand to it. Each of them noted that the fire in the fireplace was smaller than they expected for the temperature outside. Each of them stayed longer than they had planned. The fourth man, whose name was Carl Burke, and who was the most skeptical of the 4 witnesses in October, came on January 23rd when the temperature outside was 31 below zero. He came in and stood by the fireplace, which had a moderate fire, and he felt the warmth, and it was the correct warmth for a cabin with a moderate fire. And he thought he had come all this way, in the cold, for nothing. Then he noticed the floor. He crouched and pressed his palm to the plank surface and held it there. The floor was 61 degrees. The outside temperature was 31 below. The fire in the fireplace was moderate. He stayed on his knees with his palm on the floor for a long time. Ezra was watching from across the room. Carl looked up at him and said, 60 degrees in the floor, Ezra said. She put it there in November. It has been climbing since, Carl said. And the wood. Ezra pointed to the wood stack visible through the interior door to the small storage room. He had kept a careful count, the same count Ruth had asked him to keep in the same format she used in her account book. He said, 31 days of January. I have burned less than 3/4 of a cord. Carl looked at the wood stack. He was a man who knew what a cord of wood looked like, and how long it lasted, and what 3/4 of a cord in January meant against the outside temperature of 31 below. He said, less than a cord in January. In this winter, Ezra said. She said it would be less than 4 for the full winter. At this rate, it will be closer to 2. Carl said nothing for a while. He pressed the floor again in a different spot. He stood up and looked at the exit flue opening on the east wall and at the modified fireplace base where the diversion channel entered. He looked at the floor in a different area of the room and crouched and pressed it there, too. He said, "Where did she learn this?" Ezra said, "A German farmer's barn. She saw it, and she built it, and she has been running it for 4 years and keeping records. She brought the records when she installed this." Carl looked at the modified fireplace and the floor and the east wall exit flue for a long time. Then he said, "I need to talk to her." The 4 witnesses came to Ruth's claim together in the first week of February, when the cold had broken and the roads were passable again. They came in the early afternoon, and she gave them coffee, and they sat at her kitchen table, and the first thing each of them did, without being asked, was press their palm to her kitchen floor. Her kitchen floor. In a system she had been running for 4 years, on a February morning, after the coldest January stretch in the valley's recorded history, was 64 degrees. They sat at the table, and she answered every question they asked, which took the better part of 2 hours. She showed them the account book. She walked them through the channel dimensions, and the clay mix proportions, and the maintenance schedule, and the specific way the firebox diversion was designed to take a portion of the fire's gases without disrupting the draft for the main chimney. One of the men, a careful older Norwegian named Halvard Strom, took notes on the back of an envelope he had in his coat pocket. He asked the most precise questions of the 4. Questions about the channel grade and the exit flue angle and the proportion of the firebox diversion. She answered each one. He said, "I have been burning 8 cords. My wife says the cabin is cold in the mornings." She said, "How large is the cabin?" He told her. She looked at the floor plan dimensions for a moment and said, "You would need a different layout than what I built at the flood place. Your south wall placement is different, and your floor has a joist pattern that would require working around. But it can be done." He said, "Will you help me plan it?" She said, "I will come and walk the cabin in the spring before the ground is too hard to excavate." He said, "I will pay you for the planning." She said, "I will let you know the price when I see the cabin." She went to Halvard Strom's cabin in April, and to Carl Burke's cabin in May, and to 2 other properties in June and July, each time walking the structure twice and looking at the floor and the fireplace and the clay walls and the specific constraints that made each installation different from the others. She drew a plan for each one and reviewed the plan with the owner and modified it, based on what they told her about the structure's behavior in winter. She installed 4 systems in the spring and summer of 1867 and trained the Cloutier owners in the maintenance schedule and the autumn inspection procedure, showing each person what to look for and what to do when they found it. By the winter of 1867 to 1868, there were 6 underground flue systems operating in the eastern Nebraska Valley. Ruth's own system, now in its 6th winter, was performing at 1 3/4 cords for the full season. Ezra Flood's system, in its 2nd winter, with 1 full year of thermal mass accumulation, performed at 1 1/2 cords. The 4 new installations performed between 2 and 2 1/2 cords, which was the expected result for first-year systems still building their baseline thermal mass in the earth. The valley's previous collective winter fuel consumption had been approximately 40 cords for the 7 households that now had underground flue systems. After the 2nd winter, with the systems operating, the collective consumption was approximately 12 cords, 28 cords of wood not burned. 28 cords is a very large amount of wood to not burn. It is weeks of labor not spent cutting and splitting. It is timber not removed from the creek stands. It is money not spent at the Millbrook trading post on purchased wood for the families who did not have adequate timber on their claims. Ezra Flood paid the 40 rods of cedar fence posts and wire in February of 1867, when the accounting of January's fuel was complete and the 3/4 of a cord was counted and confirmed. He brought it to her claim himself with his wagon, and he said when he arrived, "I was wrong in October." She said, "You did not have enough information in October." He said, "I had enough information to know I did not know what I did not know, and I offered the bet anyway." She looked at him. This was a more honest accounting than she had expected. She said, "Yes, you did." He said, "The fence line is on the wagon." She said, "I know. I can see it." He said, "I would like to know if you would be willing to explain the system to my brother in Council Bluffs. He has a larger property and a larger fuel problem." She said she would think about it. She thought about it for a week and sent him a letter with the terms on which she would travel to Council Bluffs. The terms were her travel costs, 3 days of her labor at a rate she specified, and the right to keep any account book records she generated during the installation as her own records. He sent back a letter accepting all 3 terms. She went to Council Bluffs in April of 1868 and installed a system in his brother's cabin and trained his brother's wife in the maintenance. Because his brother's wife was the one who would be maintaining it, and she was therefore the one who needed to understand it completely. She spent 3 days at the property, and on the last day, she sat at the kitchen table with his brother's wife and went through the account book entries from her own system, year by year, showing what the numbers looked like in a working system over time and what deviations from the expected pattern indicated about what needed to be inspected. His brother's wife was a woman named Dorothea who had been cold in that cabin for 6 years and who listened to every word Ruth said with the specific attention of someone who is receiving information they have needed for a long time. The Flood family brought Ruth to 3 more properties in 1868 and 4 in 1869. By 1870, she had installed or planned systems for 17 properties across eastern Nebraska Territory, and she was charging a rate that reflected the actual value of what she was providing, which was not only the installation but the 4-year of find knowledge of how to maintain a system that most builders had never built before. The account book she had started in 1862. The daily temperature records from her first winter with the underground system was the foundation of everything that followed. The numbers in those first winter columns had told her what the system could do, and had given her the confidence to describe it accurately to other people and to back the description with evidence. The evidence was in the columns. The columns were in the book. The book was always available when someone asked whether it really worked. It really worked. The floor was warm. January cost 3/4 of a cord. The bet was paid in cedar fence posts in February, which was when the evidence was final and the accounting was complete and there was nothing left to argue about. The bet had been Ezra Flood's idea, which was the important part. She had not needed to propose the demonstration. The demonstration had proposed itself when a confident man with more certainty than information had made an offer she could accept and win. She had accepted it. She had won it. The floor had been warm all winter, and the cedar fence was on her east boundary by the end of February. And the valley was warmer the following winter, and the winter after that, because the knowledge had moved the way practical knowledge moves. Through necessity and demonstration and the specific authority of a woman who kept records for 4 years before she asked anyone to take her word for it. She kept records for 22 years. She installed systems for 27 properties. She died in 1891 at the age of 69. In the cabin she had built the first system into in 1862. With the kitchen floor at 63 degrees on a February morning that was 14 below zero outside, the earth held what it had been given. It always held. She had been giving it heat since 1862, and it had been holding it and giving it back every morning since. The same 45 degrees it had always had before she started, and the additional heat. She had been putting into it for 22 years, sitting on top of that baseline. 63 degrees on a February morning at 14 below zero. Because the earth held what it had been given, and she had been giving it heat for a very long time. The technical details of what she installed under Ezra Flood's cabin are worth examining carefully. Because the installation under an existing floor is substantially more difficult than building the system into a new floor. And the difficulty reveals what the system requires and what it can and cannot compensate for. An underground flue channel system built into a new structure is planned from the beginning. The floor is excavated before it is laid. The channels go in at grade level, in clean open space, with room to work and the ability to check every joint and every slope grade. Before the capstones are placed and the floor goes over everything, the builder can see the whole system before it is sealed. An installation under an existing floor is different in every respect. The floor must be lifted section by section as the excavation proceeds. The working space is the gap between the ground and the floor joists, which in Ezra's cabin was 14 inches at the center and less at the walls where the joists sat lower. Thomas, who was long-limbed and 19 and willing, spent the excavation days working on his side with a short-handled spade in a space that never gave him room to sit upright. He moved the excavated material on a flat board he could slide along the ground ahead of him, pushing it toward the entry point where Ruth or Ezra could remove it from above. This is not a comfortable way to work. Thomas did it for 9 days without complaint, which Ruth noted, and which she repaid by giving him the full wage she had promised, and an additional day's wage she had not promised. Because the work had been harder than she had planned for, and he had done it without being asked to do more than his share. The channel grade under Ezra's floor was the critical variable that Thomas could not verify for himself because he could not see the full run from inside the crawl space. Ruth verified it from above, lifting one floor plank at the center point of each channel run and using a long, straight rod to check that the rod lay flat against the channel bottom without gaps or high points. Where she found a high point, she had Thomas remove additional material. Where she found a low point, she had him pack the channel bottom with fresh clay and tamp it level. She verified the grade 4 times before she was satisfied. A channel with an inconsistent grade holds water at the low points. Water in a hot flue channel produces steam, and the steam produces pressure that eventually cracks the clay mortar. She had learned this from her own system in the second winter, when she had found a low point in the northeast channel run that had produced a hairline crack at 3 joint positions, all in the vicinity of the low point. She had corrected the grade and sealed the cracks and monitored them for 2 winters before she was confident the repair was holding. She told Ezra about this when he asked why she was checking the grade 4 times. She showed him the maintenance entry from her account book, the second winter crack discovery, and the repair and the subsequent monitoring. He read the entry. He said, "You found it and fixed it." She said, "That is what the annual inspection is for. Finding it before it becomes a problem rather than after." He said, "What happens if you do not find it?" She said, "You get steam in the channels. The steam pressure eventually produces larger cracks. Larger cracks allow soil moisture into the channel space. Soil moisture produces the conditions for collapse. A channel collapse under your floor requires relaying that section of channel, which means lifting the floor again, which is the work Thomas just did for 9 days, but in winter rather than autumn. He said, "So, the inspection matters," she said. "The inspection is the difference between maintenance and repair. Maintenance takes an afternoon in September. Repair takes a week in February." He nodded. He was a man who understood the economics of maintenance versus repair from farming, where the same principle operated in every piece of equipment and every structure on the property. A maintenance culture and a repair culture produce different outcomes in every domain. She was telling him something he already believed about other things and was now hearing applied to a heating system. The firebox diversion was the element she spent the most design time on before she committed to it. Because modifying an existing fireplace that was the household's primary heat source was a different kind of risk than building a new firebox from the beginning. If the diversion was too large, it would disrupt the draft of the existing chimney and produce backsmoking into the cabin. If it was too small, it would not send adequate gas volume into the channels to heat them effectively. She had calculated the proportion based on her own system's channel volume and the volume of Ezra's channels, which she had designed to be smaller than hers to suit the smaller cabin footprint and the constraints of the underfloor installation. The diversion opening she cut at the fireplace base was 2.5 inches high and the full width of the firebox back wall, which produced the proportion she had calculated and which she verified with the first fire by observing the smoke division. Most smoke rising into the chimney, a visible portion moving sideways into the diversion channel. Visible proportion is not a precise measurement. She watched it carefully, and on the third fire she decided the diversion was taking slightly too large a proportion, causing a minor disruption to the main chimney draft that was showing as a faint backdraft tendency when the wind came from the south. She reduced the diversion opening by 1/4 inch at the top edge, using a thin layer of clay mortar applied to the lintel of the diversion entry, and the backdraft tendency ceased. This adjustment, which took 10 minutes, was possible only because she had been watching the smoke carefully on 3 consecutive fires. If she had installed the system and left after the first fire, she would not have caught the adjustment needed. She stayed through 3 fires, which took 3 days, before she was satisfied that the system was running correctly and that Ezra could maintain it through the winter with the written instructions she had given him. The written instructions were 3 pages in her own hand, copied from the maintenance record she had developed for her own system and modified for the specific features of Ezra's installation. She had given him the same document she gave every subsequent installation, modified each time for the specific system. 27 properties over 22 years. 27 sets of instructions, each one different in the specific details and the same in the underlying principle. Check the channel joints in September. Seal any cracks before the first fire. Keep the diversion proportion where it belongs. Clean the exit flue annually. Record the fuel consumption and the floor temperature so you know if the system's performance is changing. 27 people who knew how to maintain what she had built for them because she had written it down in terms specific to their installation and had walked them through the procedure in person before she left. The records in the Nebraska State Historical Society include 4 of the original instruction documents she wrote, preserved by the families who received them. The documents are plain and practical, written in the direct style of someone who has explained this many times and knows what questions arise and has organized the document to answer them before they are asked. The account book, the ones she started in 1862 and kept until she died in 1891, is in the same collection, 22 winters. The first winter's numbers look like first winter numbers, slightly higher consumption and slightly lower floor temperatures than the mature system produced. By the third winter, the system had settled into its characteristic performance, and the numbers are remarkably consistent across the remaining 19 winters. The floor temperature varying only within the range that different winter severities would produce, and the fuel consumption holding at 1 3/4 to 2 quarts per winter, regardless of whether the winter was mild or severe. The consistency is the evidence. A system that produces consistent results for 19 consecutive winters is not luck, and it is not anomaly. It is a system that works. She had built a system that worked, maintained it for 22 years, installed versions of it for 27 other properties, and charged a fair price for the knowledge and labor that made it work for other people. The bet in October of 1866 was the public demonstration that moved the knowledge from her 60 acres into the valley. But the knowledge had existed since 1862, and the evidence for it had been accumulating in the account book every morning since the first winter. She had not needed the bet to know the system worked. She had needed Ezra Flood's proposition to give the knowledge a public audience. He had given her that audience by making an offer she could accept. She had accepted it. The floor had been warm. The valley had noticed. She had built the system. The system had built her reputation. The reputation had let her charge what the work was worth. The work was worth what it cost people not to freeze in January. The floor was always warm. That was always the point. There is something worth understanding about the German farmer's barn and what Ruth Calder saw in it. Because the seeing was the beginning of everything, and the seeing was not straightforward. She had gone to buy a horse. She had stood in the barn, waiting. She had felt the warmth and looked for its source, and found the ridges in the floor. She had pressed her boot to one ridge, and felt the warmth through the leather sole. She had crouched and pressed her palm to the earth between the ridges. This sequence of actions, from feeling the warmth to identifying its location to pressing her hand to the source, is not the sequence that most people would follow. Most people feel the warmth and are satisfied. The warmth is pleasant, and its source is not their immediate concern. They are there to buy a horse, and the barn being warm is a pleasant, incidental fact about the barn. Ruth pressed her hand to the floor because she was the kind of person who needed to understand the mechanism when she noticed an effect. This is a specific cognitive orientation, not a universal one, and it is the orientation that produces practical knowledge rather than pleasant experience. She had learned this orientation from her father, a man who repaired things rather than replacing them, and who had taught his children that the thing that breaks tells you something about how it works if you look at it carefully before you throw it away. She had been looking carefully at things since childhood. The barn floor was a thing she had not seen before, which made it more interesting rather than less. She pressed her hand to it. She felt the warmth. She looked for the explanation. The German farmer's explanation, in his mixture of German and English, filled in what observation alone could not provide. The channels below the floor, the stove at one end, the hot gas traveling through the channels, the earth absorbing the heat, the floor radiating it upward. She understood each piece. She understood how the pieces connected. She went home without the horse and with the understanding. 4 years later, when the system she had built from that understanding had produced 4 winters of temperature records, she had the evidence that the understanding was correct. The evidence was in the numbers. The numbers were in the account book. The account book was the thing she brought to Ezra Flood's kitchen table and put in front of him and said, "Here is what this system does. Here is 22 mornings of January temperatures at 62 degrees when it was 12 below outside. Here is what the fuel cost." The account book was the German farmer's explanation made into evidence. She had understood the explanation and built the system and generated the evidence and preserved it in the account book. The account book was the thing that moved the knowledge from her experience into other people's understanding. This is the chain, the farmer's barn. Her observation, her questions, his explanation, her design, her construction, her 4 winters of records. Her account book. The Trading Post, in October of 1866. Ezra Flood's proposition. Her acceptance. The installation. The winter. Carl Burke's palm on the floor at 31 below. The 4 witnesses at her kitchen table in February. Halvard Strom's notes on the envelope. The spring installations. Council Bluffs. 27 properties. The Nebraska State Historical Society collection. That is the chain. Every link is a person or a document or a decision. The first link is a warm barn in the early spring of 1861, and a woman who crouched to press her palm to the floor because she needed to understand what she was feeling. She pressed her palm to the floor. The chain began. The chain ran for 30 years. From the spring of 1861, when she felt the warmth in the German farmer's barn, to the February morning of 1891, when she died in her own cabin with the kitchen floor at 63 degrees. 30 years of one piece of knowledge, born in a barn, tested in a cabin, recorded in an account book, transmitted to 27 properties, and preserved in a State Historical Society collection where anyone who goes looking for it can find the daily temperature records and the instruction documents and the account of the bet. Paid in cedar fence posts in February of 1867. The bet was his idea. The knowledge was hers. The floor was warm. The chain held. Halvard Strom's notes on the envelope. The notes he took at her kitchen table in February 1867 became the basis for a letter he wrote to his brother in Telemark, Norway, in the spring of that year. His brother, who was a building contractor in Telemark, wrote back with questions about the channel dimensions and the firebox diversion proportion and the clay mix. Halvard forwarded the questions to Ruth. She answered them in a letter to Halvard that he copied and sent to his brother. The brother in Telemark wrote back a second time with a longer letter describing heating systems he had seen in older Norwegian farmhouses. Low-channel arrangements under the floors of the main rooms, fed from a kitchen fire that sounded to him like a version of what Ruth was building in Nebraska. He described them in enough detail that she understood the similarity and wrote in her account book. In the margin beside the first winter temperature records, a note that said, "Same principle. Norway also. Old." She had arrived at something old by a path that did not know the destination. The German farmer's barn to a Nebraska cabin to a letter from Telemark saying, "This is known here. It has been known here. You found it again." She had found it again. This is the way practical knowledge works in parallel. The same insight arrived at independently by people in different places facing the same problem with the same materials. Cold floor. Earth below. Channels. Heat traveling through earth. Floor warm. Same problem. Same solution. Different centuries. Different countries. Same account book format. Though the Norwegian farmhouses did not have account books because the knowledge was passed through practice rather than through writing, she wrote it down. The writing is why we know it now. The floor was always warm. The writing made it permanent. The 4 men who were witnesses at the trading post in October of 1866 each came to a different understanding of the system. And the differences are worth noting because they show how the same demonstration reaches different people in different ways. The first man, whose name was August Reinhold, pressed the warm floor in the flood cabin in December and stayed for an hour and left, and did nothing with what he had experienced for 3 months. He came to Ruth in March of 1867 and asked about the system, and she explained it. And he asked 2 questions and listened to the answers and said he would think about it. He came back in August and asked her to plan an installation for his property. He was a man who needed to think about things for a while before he acted on them. And the long interval between the experience and the action was not indifference, but process. The second man, Jacob Weiss, came to the flood cabin in January and pressed the floor and went home and came to Ruth the following week with a list of 12 written questions about the channel, dimensions, and the clay mix and the firebox modification. He was a man who prepared his questions before asking them, and who listened to the answers without interrupting, and who built his own system in the spring with her guidance, doing most of the work himself after 1 day of her showing him how. He was the most competent self-installer of the 27 properties, the one who needed the least supervision because he had asked all the right questions before he started. The third man, a younger farmer named Peter Sundstrom, who had been in the valley only since 1864, came to the flood cabin in early January and pressed the floor and asked Ezra to explain what was under it. Ezra explained what he knew, which was the surface description of the channels and the firebox modification, but not the physics of why the floor stayed warm after the fire died. Sundstrom was not satisfied with the description and came to Ruth directly the following day with a specific question that the description had not answered. Why is the floor still warm at 60 degrees when the fire has been out since midnight? She appreciated the question. It was the question that went to the mechanism rather than the surface fact, and the mechanism was the part that most people did not ask about. She explained thermal mass, the capacity of dense material to absorb heat and release it slowly, the way Earth held what the channels gave it and gave it back to the floor above over hours and days. She used an analogy. A stone left in a fire absorbs heat and stays warm long after you remove it from the fire. A pile of sand left in the same fire absorbs the same heat and stays warm the same way. The earth under the cabin is a very large pile of sand and stone that has been absorbing heat from the channels since November and is now releasing it in January. He said, "So the earth is a battery." She looked at him. Battery was not a common word in eastern Nebraska in 1867, and she was not certain he was using it correctly. She said, "What do you mean by battery?" He said, "Something that stores what you put into it and releases it later." She said, "Yes, that is exactly what the earth does. It stores the heat I put into it through the channels and releases it later. The amount stored is large enough to maintain the floor temperature through the night and into the following day." He said, "How large?" She described the volume of earth in contact with her channel system. The rough calculation she had made in 1862 to estimate the thermal storage capacity and the comparison between that estimate and the actual performance over 4 winters. The estimate had been conservative and the actual performance had exceeded it, because the Earth's thermal connection to the deeper substrate extended the effective thermal mass beyond what she had calculated for the visible channel zone. He wrote something in his pocket notebook. He said, "I want to build this, but I want to understand it well enough to explain it before I ask for help building it. She said, "Come back when you have more questions." He came back twice more that winter with additional questions. Each time, having thought about the previous answers and arrived at the next question the answers implied. She answered each set. By the time he came to her in April to plan the installation, he understood the system at a level that none of the other 27 property owners had achieved. Not because they were less capable, but because they had not asked the questions he had asked. He was 23 years old, and he had been in the valley for 3 years, and he had arrived at the question, why is the floor warm when the fire is out? And the question had led him through thermal mass and heat storage, and the physics of Earth as insulator, and the specific performance characteristics of a Nebraska clay flooreth underground channels to a point where he could have explained the system to someone else before he had built it himself. He became, in later years, the person in the valley who explained the system to newcomers who asked about it. Ruth had died in 1891, and he was still farming in the valley in 1905, and the underground flue systems were still running on 9 of the 17 properties that had installed them, the others having been replaced when new construction superseded the original cabins. He could explain the principle to anyone who asked, and he could do it from understanding rather than description, which is the better kind of explanation. He had learned it by asking why the floor was warm when the fire was out. The question is always the beginning. The question is what Ruth had asked in the German farmer's barn. Crouching at the floor ridges with her palm pressed to the earth, what is this, and how does it work? The question led to the explanation, and the explanation led to the design. And the design led to the construction, and the construction led to the system, and the system led to 27 properties, and the account book, and the instruction documents in the Nebraska State Historical Society. The question came first. The floor came from the question. The warmth came from the floor. The bet was his idea, but the question had been hers since 1861. Pressed into the warm earth of a German farmer's barn floor on a spring morning when she had gone to buy a horse and had felt something she needed to understand. She had pressed her palm to the floor and asked, "What is this?" The answer had kept 27 households warm for a generation. The Nebraska State Historical Society's collection contains one other document beyond the account book and the instruction records. It is a letter Ruth wrote in 1889, 2 years before she died, to the County Agricultural Extension Office in response to a circular they had sent requesting information about unconventional farming and building practices in the territory. She wrote 3 pages. The first page described the underground flue system in precise technical terms. The second page described the installation procedure and the maintenance requirements. The third page, which is the page that historians have cited most often, contained this passage, which the archivist transcribed in 1931. The principle is not mine. I found it in a barn and built from what I found. The German farmer found it from his father, and his father from his grandfather, and the grandfather learned it somewhere that none of us know. The Norwegian farmhouses have it in an older form, and the Roman engineers had it in a form older still. The cold problem is the same in every century, and the earth answer is the same in every century, because the earth is the same in every century. What I contributed was the account book. Keeping the numbers made it possible to show other people what the system did rather than asking them to take my word for it. The numbers spoke for themselves. I only kept them. She only kept them. 22 years of morning temperatures and fuel consumption in a plain, paper-covered ledger that is in the Nebraska State Historical Society's collection now. The numbers speaking for themselves the way she said they would. The account of what the earth held and gave back every morning from November of 1862 to October of 1884, when she stopped keeping daily records and started letting Henrik and Thomas keep them instead. The earth had been giving back what it was given since before she built the first channel. It would keep giving it back long after the last channel collapsed and the last property in the valley replaced the original cabin with something larger and more conventional. She had kept the numbers. The numbers had kept the knowledge. The knowledge had kept 27 households warm. The bet was his idea. The knowledge was hers. The floor was always warm.